Okay, so a few quick things before we get started on talking. Number one is I'm recording this, so if you're uncomfy with your voice, you should stay muted. Number two is in beginner chat on the Discord. I started a thread that if you have any questions, feel free to ask in there. And if you want to ask in voice chat, I have a part at the end, of course, for questions, as always. But yeah. Oh, number three is I'm streaming this. So if you click on my name on the Discord and then click watch stream, you should be able to see my screen and see what I'm streaming out to you. But you don't have to watch it if you do not want to. You just want to listen. So yeah. So tonight we're kind of just talking about how to get started in endgame content, as well as many different aspects of that. We're going to talk about how to get a build, how to get gear, and how to get gold, as well as talking about different aspects of in-game content and like group composition and a whole lot of other stuff. So just starting off is what is in-game content? For people who may not know, here's a brief overview. So there is 5-player content and 10-player content that is generally seen as being in-game content. When we look at 5-player content, there are dungeons, and these are generally not considered in-game anymore. They're generally considered kind of just super casual, super easy, not super rewarding, but some people like to farm it for gold. But the 5-player content that is generally seen as in-game content is Fractals of the Mist, which we'll talk a little bit more about soon. And then 10-player content is strike missions and raids, which we will also talk about more. So looking at Fractals of the Mist, it's 5-player content, and it's similar to dungeons, but where it's different than dungeons is that it is they progressively get harder the more you do them. So there are 4 tiers of fractals, each with 25 scales, and what a scale is like a single particular dungeon. So in a way, there's like 100 dungeons when you look at Fractals of the Mist. And as you go from scale 1 to scale 2 to scale 40, all the way up to scale 100, they get progressively harder and harder, but give more and more loot the higher up you go. When you're looking at later levels, starting at like scale level 20, you start needing to get ascended gear as well as agony resistance infusions, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But yeah, starting off in Fractals of the Mist, they're very easy at lower levels, but you have to get geared up and get some agony when you're looking at higher levels. So looking at strike missions, this is 10-player content, and there's kind of 2 eras of strike missions. So looking at older strike missions, which were released in Icebreed Saga, they're seen more as a stepping stone to raids. So they're like 10-player content that has more complex mechanics than you would find in most open world content, and requires some decent group composition, but is relatively easy when you compare them next to raids. However, when you look at newer strikes that released in Ender Dragons, they're seen more as a replacement of raids and are more or less the future of in-game content in Guild Wars 2, as of right now anyways. With where ArenaNet's developing the game, it's mostly strikes. When we look at Ender Dragon strikes, it's kind of inclusive, where there's 2 difficulty modes: normal mode, which most people are able to clear, and then challenge mode, which is much harder and requires people to be relatively well geared and know what they're doing. And then last thing to look at is raids. So raids, very similar to strike missions. They're 10-man content, but when you look at a strike missions are individual bosses that you fight. But when you look at raids are kind of collections of bosses. So when you look at a raid wing, it's generally a collection of 3 or 4 bosses, where you fight one boss, and then there might be a little bit of trash you have to clear, and then you fight the second boss, then you clear a little bit more trash, and then you get to the final boss and kill it. So when you do strikes, you get just straight to the boss, but if you're wanting to do raids and you want to do the 3rd boss of a raid, you need to clear the first bosses in that raid wing, or have someone in your group that has already done it. So that's basically what in-game content is available. I guess one note to look at is that's group content that you can look at, but in-game in Guild Wars 2, as most people know, is very kind of what you want it to be. It could be, fashion or open world or PvP, whatever, but we're talking about raids and strikes here. So getting into in-game content, we're going to look at getting a character ready, which is basically looking at builds and gear. So on the left side, we can see I have my gear, which is all my armor, weapons, accessories, backpack, all that stuff. The gear that has stats, you put runes and sigils into it and all that stuff. And then on the right side is builds. This is the skills and traits that you put into your builds and changes how you play and like what you do. So starting off with builds, getting builds is a very kind of complex idea. There's a lot of different websites and a lot of different YouTube channels and different resources that you can look at. We're just going to look at a couple very briefly. So looking at snowcrows.com, this website is designed for strikes, raids, and fractals in mind, and it's designed to be very optimized builds. And they have beginner builds, so I am new to the game and struggling with playing. You might look at beginner builds. And then they have more experienced builds. I am pretty experienced with the game. I want to push myself to be better in groups. You want to look at like their main build page. So if you're new to the game, it might be good to get a beginner build going, and then you can transition that build into a more optimized build. There are a lot of other websites besides Snowcrows. So here I have listed Muckluck Labs, Discretize, Guildgen, and MetaBattle. But really there are a lot of resources at looking at builds. For low intensity builds that only require a few actions per minute on your skill bar. And there's just a lot of websites. But if you're just kind of getting started into looking for raids and you kind of want a very basic approach, I would recommend Snowcrows. Looking at Snowcrows, you can look at beginner builds or look at their more optimized builds. So with builds, once you picked out a particular build on Snowcrows, for example, looking at the build, it has certain armor and weapons and stats that you need to get in order to gear that build up. So when we're looking at getting started in in-game content, looking at exotic gear, which is the second best gear in the game, is gear that is going to be able to let you do content and do it just fine, if we're being honest here. There is ascended gear, which we'll talk about more in a minute, which is just better stats and you'll perform better. But when you're looking at all in-game content besides high-level fractals, you can clear it perfectly fine in just exotic gear. So there are a few different ways to get exotic gear. So there's like doing dungeons, you can get exotic gear, and then crafting, and then some other ways. But the most simple and straightforward way for most people that I walk people through is using the trading post. So you need gold for that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you go to the trading post and you look at armor and weapons, you can select gear that is good for the build that you're running. So if you're running a build, for example, that does power stuff, that requires berserker gears, you can look for level 80 exotic gear for your class that has power, precision, and ferocity. You can buy full armor set, full weapon set, full accessories, all that stuff. Buy it all with 10 to 15 gold, depending on what stats you have. Sometimes 40 if you're doing like celestials. And then once you get exotic gear, you can put it on and honestly just get started in in-game content. So moving beyond exotic gear, you can eventually upgrade that gear to ascended gear. So one way that many people get ascended gear, and this is how I got my first ascended gear set, is to just craft it. This is expensive, but a pretty simple and straightforward way where you just level up your crafting, get all the materials you need for it. You can buy some with gold, and then you just craft ascended gear. There's two ways to kind of craft ascended gear. One is more expensive way is to just craft it straight up. And then a second way, which is a little bit more complicated, is that you can incorporate content like PvP or world versus world or fractals into your crafting process, where it'll be a little bit cheaper to craft it, but it requires you to do that content. Beyond crafting, ascended drops are rewards for doing endgame content. So if you just do endgame content like raids or strikes, you'll get ascended gears drops, and then you can use that to replace exotic gear. Looking at like one of those things, I'm looking right now at the Icebreed Saga Ascended Armor and Weapons vendor in the Eye of the North, where you get blue profit crystals from doing Icebreed Saga strikes. And if you just do Icebreed Saga strikes every day or a few times every week, you can eventually accumulate a ton of currency, and then you can spend that currency alongside some gold to get a full ascended armor set, as well as weapons. This is true with Ended Dragons strikes, as well as raids in both Path of Fire and Heart of Thorns. So, we've talked a lot about spending gold, where you need gold to get exotic stuff, and you need gold to get ascended stuff. So we're going to go over some simple methods to get gold. A lot of people struggle with getting gold, and it is complex and simple to get gold at the same time. You just kind of have to know what to do. For people that are looking at some very complex gold farming methods, they can look at the Fast community at that website there, and they show a lot of optimized ways to get gold with auto parking and meta farming and routes and stuff like that. But we're going to look at 3 simple methods for gold farming. So the first of the simple methods is just daily routines, where you log in every day, you do some content, and then you log off. And doing that content will reward you quite a bit of gold. The most easiest and simple daily routine that most people know about is completing your daily achievement, where you just complete 3 different achievements in PvE, PvP, or Road vs. Road, and you get 2 gold. Pretty simple. I think the fastest I've done it in is like 90 seconds before. Sometimes it might take longer, like 15 minutes, but doing that, easy 2 gold. And then you can look at other daily routines. So fractal dailies are very, very popular. I don't know the exact amount of gold you can get from doing tier 4 dailies and CMs. I think it's around 40 gold a day. But doing those every day can get you a lot of gold. And then you can look at auto parking, which is basically where you take a character that you don't play a whole lot and you park them somewhere that has some valuable resources, and you log into them every day, collect that resources, and then log back into your main. There are a lot of different auto parking locations. A couple of popular ones is the Biora Marches chests, and then Verdant Brink Flax farm that's underneath Jaka Itzel. So looking at the second method is meta trains. So this is basically just running from popular meta to meta that rewards a lot of gold that I think a couple of us right now are doing. So one very popular train that TOA does quite a bit is Tequato to Grothmar Effigy to Leyline Anomaly to Chakra to Octavine to Dragonstorm. If you do all of those metas, which takes about an hour and a half, I believe it's like 36 gold. So that's really good. And then there's a ton of other metas that people do a lot, such as Pinata and Crystal Oasis, or Doppelganger, or the Deathbrander Shatter, as well as a lot more. And then the third method is just a straight up gold farm. So running a very specific meta or series of events over and over and over for gold. Some popular versions of this is Silver Waste's Reba, which is available to all players, and then Dragonfall, as well as Drizzlewood Coast. So you go to those maps, and then you complete events, get a lot of gold, and profit. So one very important concept of getting gold that a lot of people don't seem to understand is that gold is very similar to like money in real life. So there is liquid gold and material gold. So liquid gold is just what you have in your wallet. You get 2 gold liquid just from completing your daily every day. But as you're doing your daily, you're also getting material gold. So the drops you get from mobs and from events and all that stuff that goes into your material storage, that's not in your wallet, but it's still gold. So I have just a random screen cap from my Guild Wars 2 efficiency showing me my basic crafting materials tab. If you look at all of the resources that I have gathered right there, if I sold them all, I would have 102 gold. So maybe I have 5 gold in my wallet right now, but if I sold all of the stuff right there on the screen, I would have 102 gold in my wallet. If you look at the top, you can see I have 630 gold in my material storage right now, where if I sold everything, I would have that much gold. So now that we looked at some builds and gear and some gold craft, or some gold stuff, we're going to look at kind of some random parts of combat that is important for people to understand as they approach in-game content. So I just have a bunch of videos around these that are kind of just random, if I'm being honest, that show some stuff. But the first thing we want to look at is movement. So in Guild Wars 2, the combat is very, I don't know, the word fluidic, if you want to say it. You're going to be moving around a lot. So it's important that you kind of get the coordination down for being able to do skills and to move around at the same time. This can be really challenging for like newer players, as well as people that aren't used to playing video games or maybe MMOs specifically. So next is camera positioning. Again, this is kind of a really random video, but camera positioning in combat is super important. So a lot of newer people tend to have their camera zoomed in super close, kind of just looking up their butt, and it's awkward from their perspective, and then it's not doing them a whole lot when it comes to doing content. So if you look at my screen right now, I have my camera zoomed out pretty far out, which allows me to see basically this whole area I'm in while I'm fighting this random boss, and it lets me see kind of everything that's going on instead of what my back looks like. When you're looking at specific bosses that you're fighting, sometimes you might want your camera in certain positions. So if you've done Veil Guardian, it's very nice to have your camera straight down on top of your character. And then sometimes like Slothazor, where the arena's a little tighter, having your camera all the way out might not be super good. So it kind of depends on the fight that you're looking at. But generally speaking, across the board, being able to have your camera zoomed all the way out so you can see more than just your character is super important. Next is Breakbars, which is something that most people nowadays know about, but when they first released in Heart of Thorns, it was a very big struggle to get people to understand what Breakbars are. So Breakbars are kind of like the secondary bar underneath a mob's health bar. So to do breakbar damage, you have to do what's either soft crowd control abilities or hard crowd control abilities. So soft crowd control abilities are damage over times or conditions, such as chill or cripple or slow, that basically just ticks away from their breakbar as the condition goes on. And then hard crowd control abilities are stuff like pulls and knockdowns and pushbacks, that when you fight a normal mob, it would eat them across the room, but when you're fighting a boss that has a breakbar, it just does a ton of breakbar damage to them. When you get a breakbar damaged all the way to 0, a boss will generally get an exposed effect, which will let the group do a ton more damage to them for 10 seconds, or depending on the boss, a longer time. So it's super useful to be able to break breakbars in order to get a damage buff. And then also some bosses require you to deal with breakbars as a mechanic, where if you don't break the bar, like, you'll die, or other mechanics depending on the specific boss you're fighting. So next thing to look at, which is a very small and minor part of the game, which is most important in Fractals and not so much in Raids and Strikes, is looking at combos. So combos are when you put down an ability that says it's a combo field, and then using a ability that is either a combo finisher or a combo projectile inside that field. What this does, it basically lets you kind of get bonus attacks and like bonus buffs when you do a combo. So two very popular combo fields, which I'll go back to the start here, is using a fire field, which I just used right there, and then a blast finisher inside that fire field, and it gives might, which we'll talk more about in a second. And then another very popular combo is putting down a water field and then using a blast finisher inside that water field. It'll let us heal. some builds incorporate combos into their builds and their rotations, but not everyone does that. So next, we're looking at boons. So this is, again, something that a lot of people kind of don't have a full understanding about just how important this is when it comes to in-game content. But boons is really everything when we're looking at in-game content and being able to clear stuff. So I have a full list here of boons in the game, but we're going to look at 4 of them in a little bit more depth. So the third one here is Fury, which critical chance is increased by 20%, and its stacks duration. So this is super useful for builds to be able to get up to 100% critical chance. So doing like a critical strike, you deal twice as much damage with that strike. So having 100% critical chance means you're just dealing twice as much damage as you normally would. Next is Might, which stacks up to 25 stacks, and it increases outgoing damage. So when you have 25 stacks of Might, you're just dealing a ton more damage than if you had 0 Might on you. Next, super important is Quickness, which skills and actions are faster. So when you're dealing like a normal attack, it just has like a wind up time and you like do the attack. Quickness makes this much faster, so you're able to attack more in a shorter time frame. And then last one is Alacrity, which is skills recharge faster. So when you use a skill, say, looking at my skill bar right now, when you do Symbol of Vengeance with a Guardian Axe, it has an 8-second cooldown on it, but when you have Alacrity, that 8 seconds turns into 6 seconds or something. I forget the exact amount. But basically, doing that means you can use skills more often, which means you can do more in a shorter time frame. So when we're looking at having all boons on us, when you don't have any boons on you, you're not getting a lot of benefit. But when you have all these boons on you, you're going to have higher critical strike chance, have more damage, be able to attack faster, be able to do skills sooner, and so on. So it's super useful to have boons on you when you're doing content, because it just makes everything much easier, and for some groups it makes stuff possible where you wouldn't be able to clear it otherwise. So next, kind of similar to boons, is healing. So healing, most people know, like skill bar 6 for example, regenerating health. So when you're low on health, you use healing, you get health back. Pretty straightforward. But when we're looking at healing in Guild Wars 2, it's kind of similar to other MMOs, where you have classes that are able to dish out a lot more healing compared to other classes. As such, they're healers. So I'm playing Healbrand right now, where I'm just dealing random stuff, or killing random stuff in Saitung Province. And if you look at my health bar, it drops down. I use healing skills, it goes back up. And because I'm running Healbrand, I'm able to do a lot more healing compared to a thief that has just a healing skill on them. So when we're looking at in-game content, healing is super important because it lets people stay alive. And if you die during in-game content and the entire group dies, you're not going to kill the boss. Pretty straightforward. So looking at boons and then looking at healing, we can look at group compositions. So when we look at groups in raids and strikes, we're looking at 10 people. And then when we're looking at groups and fractals, we're looking at 5 people. And all those forms of content, it's pretty much like the same thing across the board. So in fractals, you just have one group of 5. And then in raids and strikes, you can look at it as 2 groups of 5. So when looking at a group, you want to make sure you have every single buff or boon covered for that group. So 2 big ones are Quickness and Alacrity, and then you can look at Might and other stuff as well. You want to make sure that every single person in that group of 5 has Alacrity and Quickness on them at all times. Additionally, you can look at a healer as well, where you want each group to have 1 healer to be able to keep them alive while they deal with stuff. So Some content only requires one healer because it doesn't deal a ton of, like the boss doesn't deal a ton of damage, or some fights require 2 healers, and then sometimes you might need a 3rd healer depending on your group and like the boss you're fighting. And then if you're super sweaty, sometimes you need 0 healers because you kill a boss before it kills you. You kill a boss before it deals damage. You don't need to heal through the damage. But that's very, very optimized and professional, I guess you could say, situations. So looking on the right, a Reddit user made this cheat sheet that is super, super helpful, where it kind of shows the anatomy of a squad. And this is only like a little snippet of the cheat sheet. But we can see in each subgroup, there's 3 different example subgroups here. We want at least 1 quickness and 1 alacrity person, as well as a healer. And then you fill out the rest of the slots with people that deal damage. You can have a healer that doubles up with quickness or doubles up with alacrity, which would then let you have another slot for a straight damage dealer. So like Heal Mech, for example, is a healer that does a ton of healing and also provides full alacrity uptime. And then Heal Brand is a really good healer that provides full quickness uptime. So when you condense those 2 rows, you don't need a healer, an alacrity, a quickness, and 2 DPS. You then need a healer that does alacrity, a quickness, and then 3 DPS. So like the anatomy of a squad cheat sheet on the right shows like some different example subgroups. Depending on who you have and like what's covered, you can really alter your group composition to fit the needs of making sure everyone has a boon, all the boons they need, and that they're able to stay alive. So next, here's a video where I bullied War Tector. But positioning in Guild Wars 2 is super, super important. So if you're far away from whoever is healing or whoever is giving boons, you're not going to get boons or healing. Meaning you're not going to deal damage and you're not going to stay alive. You want to stay together. When we're looking at Guild Wars 2 as a game, stacking is basically kind of what endgame content is, where everyone in a raid group stays together so that they can give each other boons, heal each other up, and stay alive. So looking at this video again, we can see me and War Tector fighting this boss, and you can kind of see I am giving boons to War Tector right now, meaning he's able to deal more damage to the mob he's fighting. But if I back away from War Tector and I try to give him boons, he's not going to get it, meaning he's not going to benefit from the boons that I'm throwing out on the field. So in-game content, we want to stay together as a group so we can stay buffed up and stay alive. So next, I kind of want to go over mechanics. So basically, what are mechanics? Mechanics are like the individual obstacles that you must overcome. So depending on the boss you fight, there are different mechanics, and when you're approaching any boss in raids, strikes, or fractals, you have to learn the mechanics alongside learning your class in order to beat the boss. So, however, there are some mechanics that I want to highlight right now that are kind of global mechanics, I guess you could say, that multiple bosses use in their fight. So one of those mechanics is bombs or a red circle underneath people's feet. So there's several different examples in this video, but you can see people get circles underneath their feet, meaning they have to spread out from the group. When the circle fills up or the bomb goes off, it's going to deal damage to everyone around them. So if you're by yourself, all it's going to do is deal damage to you. But if you're on a group, it's going to deal damage to everyone in the group. So you don't want to do that. You want the damage to only go to you. So when you get like a red circle underneath your feet that's a bomb, you want to spread out so you don't murder your friends. That's a long video. But there's a lot of different examples. So here's like strikes. And I think right here we can see, or not right there. I have some examples in here where people stood on top of each other and then they died. So we saw there those two people, Jojo and Yumiko, I think it was. I'm bullying you here. They were on top of each other. They both took a ton of damage, while the other 3 people were fine. Next is green circles. So generally speaking, when we're looking at a green circle mechanic, as you can see right now, is a big circle with 4 arrows going into it. We want the group to sit inside that green circle, because it's going to deal a ton of damage to the person that has a green circle. Unless people are inside the green circles, then it's going to deal a tiny bit of damage to everyone inside of it. Looking at some content, such as the Aether Blade challenge mode, the green circle requires a very specific amount of people to be inside of it, but the concept is still the same. Green circle, people get in it, people stay alive. It's kind of the opposite of the red circles underneath people's feet, where when everyone gets a red circle, you want to spread out and not hurt each other. With a green circle, you want to get in to not hurt. Last kind of global mechanic to look at is wave mechanics. So there's a lot of different boss fights. Tequato, for example, has a very popular wave mechanic where it's basically a wave, and it comes out from wherever the boss is striking, and it goes out a long distance, and you can jump over it. If you don't jump over it, depending on the boss, you might take a ton of damage. You might straight up die. You might get knocked back. You might get feared. Across all those examples, you just don't want to get hit by the wave. So you could either block it with Aegis or like a block ability, or you can jump over it. So kind of wrapping it up a little bit, is very specific how to get started in endgame content. So here's kind of like a step-by-step for you. Number 1, figure out what build you want to play. You can look at Snow Crow's beginner builds or Snow Crow's normal builds, or look at any other website like Mukluk Labs or any low intensity build website and figure out a build you want to play. And then once you do that, number 2, you can get enough hero points for that build. So most builds anyways use elite specializations, where you need to do 25 expansion hero challenges in order to get all those hero points. And yeah. Number 3 is to gear that build up. So this requires you to do some gold farming, and then to get exotic gear or ascended gear, get the gear you need and put it on you. And then number 4 is to try out your gear and your build a little bit in the open world or on DPS golems or whatever you want, dungeons, whatever. And then number 5 is to jump into content. So you're in TOA, we do a ton of content. We do strikes almost every day. We do raids once a week. But there's also looking for groups and yeah, map chat. Sometimes people are begging to have people join their strike group. One additional thing is I recommend that people take a look at add-ons. We have links for this on the resources page on the Discord. But looking at Arc DPS, it's a tracker for the group to track individual, everyone's individual damage and like boon and breakbar and stuff like that. So you can kind of see on the left, there's like a lot of different options, but if you look at the bottom, you can see my damage that I'm doing as well as my boon uptime. So quickness, I had a very sloppy 56% quickness uptime when I killed that Moa or whatever that I fought to get this picture. And then on the right, second add-on that's super important to look at is Blish HUD. So Blish HUD is a lot of stuff, but there's pathing modules and then timer modules, which are super helpful when we're looking at in-game content. So with like timers, I believe, it will show when certain mechanics during raid boss fights are appearing, which is super helpful, especially for people that are learning. So for example, in the Sabbatha raid boss fight, cannons spawn every 30 seconds at a different location, and with having the timers module, it's going to tell you when the cannon is spawning and where it's spawning, which is super helpful. So you don't have to rely on your memory or having it written down on like a notepad or whatever. So then finally, when you're approaching in-game content, I think it's important for people to have a goal or kind of an idea for what you're wanting to do. So basically, like, what are your goals in in-game content? People have different goals depending on what they want. Some people are, I want to clear every boss once, where you just want to experience the content. Some people, kind of like me, I want to get achievements, where they want to get all the achievements and all like the optional bonus objectives and boss fights. Third, very popular, is I want to get legendary armor. So you have to do a ton of Heart of Thorns raids, and then you'll get legendary armor. And then number 4, which I'm sure is nobody, is I want to spend time with friends, where you're just hanging out with people, having a good time on Friday evening, and just killing some bosses. And that is everything that I have to go over, kind of for like an introduction for in-game content. If anyone has any questions, I'm recording, so if you want to talk in voice chat, feel free to ask a question. But I also have in beginner chat, you can write some questions if you want, and then if no one has questions, that's whatever. So if anyone has any questions, feel free. So where's a good place to download the add-ons? Individual websites. So if you go to the resources page on our Discord, which is at the very top, and then you look at helpful resources, so there is DPS meter, which has a link to the website, which is deltaconnected.com/arcdps. There you can download that. And then right above that is helpful overlays, which is blishhud.com. And you can go to that website to download blishhud, and it'll walk you through all that. So DPS golems are in a few different areas of the game. But there's 2 specific areas. I guess with that 2, there's really 1. So the smaller area that you can look at DPS golems is within the Fractals of the Mist lobby. There are DPS golems that you can fight against. But the main area in the game is in the raid lobby, which is the Lion's Arch Aerodrome, which is in like the southern area of Lion's Arch by Fort Mariner. You can go into, I believe it's called the Special Ops Combat Training Arena, and there is a panel that you can talk to spawn a DPS golem, as well as giving buffs to yourself and a ton of other stuff. So what are general DPS goals to aim for on DPS and offensive support builds? So I guess there's a few different approach to this. So the first one, which is very, very optimized, we can look at snowcrows.com. This is the best of the best. They spend 23 hours a day locked in their basement practicing DPS rotations, and they're able to get these numbers. And this is very perfect optimized scenarios where they're standing still fighting a golem and they have every boon on them. So top here is Condition Virtuoso is dealing 41,000 damage per second. When we're looking at actual scenarios, it can fluctuate depending on the boss fight. So for example, if you're fighting a boss that requires you to move more and damage less, your DPS is going to be lower. But generally speaking, looking at these numbers, 80% of a benchmark is pretty good for if you're really, really good at the game, at super experienced. So what's 80% of 41,000? 32,000? Something like that. So that's very, very good if you're like super good. And then if you're looking at kind of average, it's more averaging 10 to 15,000 in more beginner scenarios, and then 15,000 to 20,000 in more better scenarios with a better group. When you're looking at support builds, it's the same deal, but just much less damage. So generally speaking, for support builds, like 2,000 to 4,000 damage per second, I guess. Again, depending on the boss fight. So TLDR, that question, for beginners, I would say 10,000 damage per second. For advanced players, 20,000 damage per second. And then for very, very good players, 30,000 damage per second. And then for support builds, around 4,000. Yes, so with Fractals, progressing in Fractals, you want to get agony infusions, and you want to put that into ascended gear. the higher level fractal you get to, or fractal scale you get to, you want more agony infusions, which requires more scented gear. So when you're looking at the highest level fractal, which is scale 100, you need 150 agony infusions, which is basically putting +9 agony in every single armor and weapon and ring and so on slot. So I'm going to end the stream to Discord now. And then thank you everyone for showing up. If you ever have any questions in the future, be sure to check Discord. We have beginner chat, which has basically just a space for everyone to ask questions. And then if you have questions more related to builds, we have build help underneath the rating category where you can ask questions there. And feel free to ask anytime, and someone at some point will respond to you.